the proud father, and the legacy. The mornings always began before the sun. Arturo Varela liked the world best when it was still half asleep, when the air outside the window carried that mix of dew and the faint sweetness of mesquite. He would sit at the kitchen table, the coffee already cooling because he poured it too soon, and listen to the first sounds of his 4 boys stirring in the back room. Blankets dragging, small feet against cold tile, someone whispering a complaint that today would surely be another work day. He loved those boys fiercely, though love for him had always worn work clothes. Daniel, the oldest, moved like a small shadow of his father, already stiff in the shoulders even at 10. Samuel, talkative and restless, asked why they had to fix everything in the world that other people broke. David, 6, was all elbows and enthusiasm, swinging tools twice his size. Little Elias, only 4, followed them all with a broom that never seemed to touch the ground. The truck outside smelled of oil and sun-heated vinyl. When Arturo turned the ignition, the engine coughed like an old man clearing his throat. They would drive through the parts of town nobody bragged about, blocks of sagging fences and low houses whose paint had long turned to dust. The sky would be the color of unpolished copper, and the boys would sit silently, half awake, their knees touching in the cab, breathing in the mixture of gasoline and the faint cinnamon their mother had packed into a paper bag for breakfast.
"This one has good bones,"
Arturo would say when he saw a place leaning a little less than the rest. He always said that, as if houses were living things waiting to be forgiven. Inside, the smell hit first: damp carpet, smoke, and something else. The sour rot of leftovers gone bad. There would be a moment where none of them moved, just listened to the flies tapping against the window glass. Then Arturo would roll up his sleeves and begin. The sound of nails being pulled from wood, the scrape of old paint, the hollow thud of broken cabinets landing in piles. The boys followed his rhythm without question. When they found the bathroom, they found the toilet filled to the rim, stained, and used long after it should have been abandoned. Arturo stood in the doorway, jaw tightening. He didn't curse. He just breathed out slowly through his nose, the way a man does when he's deciding between anger and endurance. "All right, boys," he said softly. "Family cleans up its own mess." And though it wasn't their mess, they believed him. They worked until the sun turned the dust in the air gold. The smell of bleach mixed with sweat, and their shirts stuck to their backs. At lunch, they sat on the front steps eating sandwiches that had grown warm and soft, the taste of dust still on their tongues. A breeze would pass, carrying the scent of wet drywall and distant barbecue from some other neighborhood, a reminder that somewhere else people were resting. Birthdays came and went inside those same houses. On one, Daniel turned 12 while scraping wallpaper that smelled of mildew and lemon cleaner. Arturo handed him a cupcake with one candle stuck crookedly in the top. They laughed, but the laughter was small. "We'll celebrate when this one's finished," Arturo said. It was always when this one's finished. Tenants came and went. Some were kind, leaving little notes that said thank you for fixing the heater. Most weren't. There were the ones who smoked indoors until the ceilings turned yellow, the ones who filled rooms with trash bags that leaked onto the floor, the ones who fought so loud the neighbors called the police. And there were the worst, the ones who simply didn't care. They'd leave holes in the walls big enough for a child to climb through, leave food rotting in sinks, leave a smell that no amount of paint could hide. When the family returned after a tenant moved out, Arturo's steps slowed at the door. He could smell it before he turned the knob, that mix of mold, sweat, and hopelessness. Sometimes he'd find drugs hidden in the vents or inside the insulation, small bags half buried in the drywall. The boys would look to him for a reaction. He'd only nod, tired. "They got lost," he'd say. "We'll help the house find its way back." And so the cycle went. On. The boys learned the rhythm of repairs like other kids learned songs. Hammer, scrape, sweep, paint. The hiss of an aerosol can become their lullaby. They knew the sound of nails in coffee cans and the way fresh plaster smelled almost sweet for a moment before turning to chalk. Holidays didn't stop the work. On Christmas Eve, they were patching a ceiling while carols played faintly from a neighbor's radio. On New Year's Eve, they were painting baseboards, watching fireworks through dusty windows. The world seemed to celebrate around them while they kept fixing what others had ruined. And yet, Arturo believed he was giving them something greater than rest, discipline, pride, a kind of armor against the poverty he'd known as a child. He would tell them, "If you can rebuild a house, you can rebuild a life." The boys believed him even as their small hands blistered. They believed him because his conviction filled the room, more than the smell of paint thinner ever could. As years went on, the houses changed, but the feeling did not. Every home was a chance to make up for the last disaster, and every disaster came sooner than expected. Arturo rented cheap because he had to, and cheap rent brought trouble. There were summers when the boys scrubbed walls so filthy the sponges turned black in seconds, winters when they worked without heat, their breath white clouds in the air. Yet Arturo would smile and say, "Hard work warms you better than any heater." He didn't see that sometimes they looked past him at the window where the lights of other houses glowed soft and still, families laughing, resting, existing without needing to fix everything first. He didn't see the quiet envy that flickered in their eyes before they turned back to the work. Years passed quietly, the way years do when the days are all the same color. The four boys grew tall, the truck grew older, the houses seemed to lean a little more each summer. Arturo still woke before the sun. The air outside smelled of dust that had not yet settled, of wet cedar from a rain 2 nights before. His hands were cracked in the creases where paint and time had gathered. He rubbed them together, listening to the tiny sound of skin against skin, and smiled faintly. A man could build an entire life out of calluses. The boys were men now, though he still called them by the old names. Daniel had a job that required a shirt with buttons and a small badge. Samuel, the second, was the one who still asked questions, though his voice was lower now, carrying a trace of weariness. David, the third, had inherited his father's restlessness, driving from one side of the city to the other doing repair work for anyone who would pay. And little Elias, no longer little, had that soft kindness that made people trust him too quickly. They still gathered sometimes at one of the rentals when something needed fixing. The smell was always the same: paint thinner, old carpet, the sweetness of plywood dust. Arturo would stand in the doorway, taking it all in like a man standing before an altar. "It's good," he would say, running his hand along a wall that was still damp from plaster. "It'll be good again." He said it not only to the house, but to himself. When Samuel told him he was getting married, the news hit Arturo like sunlight through a dirty window. Sharp, beautiful, and blinding. He felt proud and frightened all at once. A son leaving meant the circle might break. The rhythm that had kept them all together might finally slow. The night before the wedding, Arturo walked the backyard of one of his better properties, the grass crisp under his boots, the smell of cut weeds mixing with motor oil. The house was small, but solid, one of the few that tenants hadn't ruined. He looked up at the half-painted eaves and imagined his son there, laughter inside the rooms instead of echoes. The decision felt right. He would give Samuel the house, a father's gift, a clean start. On the wedding morning, he pressed the key into Samuel's hand. The metal was still cold from the night air. "It's yours," he said simply. "Paid off." A man should start with something of his own. Samuel blinked hard, unable to speak, and his bride whispered a thank you that trembled. Arturo nodded, clearing his throat. "Take care of it better than I did the others." For a while, that small house became a symbol of everything good between them. The smell of fresh paint gave way to coffee in the mornings, bread in the oven, soft music from an old radio. When Arturo visited, he sat on the couch and traced the grain of the wood floor with his shoe, proud that something he had once rebuilt was finally whole. But seasons change quietly, and gratitude can sour without anyone noticing. The first time Arturo asked for help again, it was small. "Mijo, I just need you for a weekend. The east side place flooded. We'll patch it and be done." Samuel hesitated. He had plans with his wife, but agreed. He always agreed. The second time it was a loan, then a third. And every time, the same phrase followed, soft but heavy as rain on tin. "You do this for me, right? After all, I gave you that house." He never said it in anger, but it hung in the air like the smell of turpentine, sharp, impossible to ignore. Samuel's wife began to dread the ringing phone. Arturo would call and talk about taxes, tenants, roof repairs, always circling back to that quiet reminder of what he had given. She would press her hand against her chest after every call, feeling her heart race with something she couldn't name. Gratitude had turned into a kind of debt. And debt, no matter how loving, wears down the soul. The brothers noticed. During family dinners, the air carried a stiffness that not even the smell of roasted meat could soften. Daniel would talk about work to fill the silence. David would make jokes that no one laughed at. Elias would glance at his father, searching for the man who used to hum while working. But Arturo's hum had gone quiet. He was still proud, still generous, still convinced that work was the purest form of love. Yet something in his shoulders had settled into a permanent tension, as if he carried invisible lumber across them. The rentals began to fight back. Years of quick fixes gave way to deeper cracks. A storm peeled shingles off like paper. Another tenant left behind walls streaked with something unrecognizable, a smell between mildew and despair. Arturo scrubbed until the fumes burned his eyes, muttering that people had forgotten how to care for things. The boys offered to help modernize, to manage the properties properly, to use the new computer systems they understood. He shook his head. "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive," he said, not cruelly, but with the weight of habit. When his hands first began to tremble, he told no one. He blamed the cold, then the coffee. The tremor grew, gentle but constant, like a bird fluttering inside his wrist. He worked through it, pretending not to see the crooked lines of caulk, the paint that bled outside the tape. Pride is a quiet thing. It hides behind the smell of thinner and the hum of a drill. Winter came and found him slower. The air in the houses seemed to grow heavier, filled with the scent of damp plaster that never quite dried. He would stand by the window of whichever property he was fixing and watch the sky turn the color of old metal. Sometimes snowflakes drifted in through cracks in the frame, melting on his hands. He thought about the boys as children, their laughter echoing through empty rooms. He wondered when exactly work had replaced joy. One evening he sat in the truck outside Samuel's house, the gift house, and watched the warm yellow light spill from the kitchen window. Inside, he could see his son setting the table, his daughter-in-law moving gracefully, the faint steam of dinner rising. The sight filled him with pride and something sharper. He wanted to knock, to come inside, but he could already hear how the conversation would go.
"Dad, we talked about this. You need to let us help you differently."
So he stayed where he was until the engine cooled and the smell of gasoline faded. When he finally drove home, the night smelled of burnt leaves. The road stretched ahead in a narrow ribbon of headlights. The shaking in his hands made the steering wheel vibrate softly, a reminder that even the strongest tools wear down. He didn't notice the tears until one fell onto the back of his hand. He wiped it away quickly, embarrassed though no one was there to see. The air in the cab was thick with the ghost of paint dust, coffee, and old leather. He whispered to himself, "It'll be good again," and the sound was barely more than a breath. Back at the small apartment, he sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp glowing above. The room smelled faintly of bleach and solitude. He opened his notebook to list repairs for the coming week, but his handwriting had turned to tremors, letters leaning like tired men. The pen slipped once, leaving a smear of ink. He stared at it until the line looked like a crack in plaster. Outside, a dog barked. Somewhere, a radio played a slow bolero. Arturo listened and felt the ache of a man who has given everything shape, but never given it rest. He poured himself another cup of coffee. It went cold before he finished it. The winter that followed was the one that finally showed him he could not keep outrunning time. It began with a letter, not the first, but the first one he actually opened. The envelope was thick, government white, carrying the flat smell of paper that has passed through too many hands. He sat at the table, the formica cool beneath his forearms, and slid it open with a butter knife. The words were not cruel, just firm. Past due. Amount owed. Immediate attention required. It was the kind of letter that would have sent him straight out to hustle another weekend of work in the old days, but his hands were slower now, and the weekend wasn't enough anymore. He leaned back, listening to the soft buzz of the refrigerator, the faraway sound of a neighbor's TV. The apartment felt too big for one man, but too small for all the worries he carried. The air had that faint smell of old coffee and pine sol, the smell of someone trying to keep things clean while life itself was fraying. He thought, just for a moment, about calling Daniel. Then he thought about calling Samuel. And then, as always, he thought about how many times he had called already. The boys had never stopped loving him. That part stayed. But love and availability are not the same thing. They had wives now, children with colds, rent of their own, jobs that did not pause because their father had ignored a tax bill. So he folded the letter, set it beneath a sugar jar, as if weight could fix debt, and decided he would figure it out. That weekend, he drove to one of the old West Side houses, a small one with peeling green trim and a porch that had shifted so many times it seemed to sigh under his boots. The cold air tasted of exhaust and wet dirt. He unlocked the door, and the smell hit him first, heavy and humid, sour laundry, stale cigarettes, and that darker smell that meant plumbing had failed and no one had cared. He covered his nose with his sleeve. "Why do people live like this?" he whispered, not angry, just deeply tired. The living room floor was littered with fast food bags, cups with dried soda rings, a wet spot on the carpet that had spread outward like a bruise. In the bathroom, the toilet had given up. Instead of calling, the tenants had simply kept using it. The bowl was full, water murky, the smell thick enough to taste. It was a kind of disrespect that stabbed deeper than unpaid rent. It was a refusal to honor effort. He stood in that small bathroom a long time, the window fogged, the air warm with rot. His hand began to shake harder than usual. He reached out to steady himself on the sink and felt how unsteady the sink was, too. Everything in the room seemed to tremble with him. And in that moment, surrounded by filth he did not create, he felt the age of every single year he had spent cleaning up what others ruined. Once, when the boys were young, he would have called down the hall, "All right, boys, family cleans up its own mess." But there were no boys there now. They were at their own kitchen tables, smelling their own coffee, tucking in their own children. He was alone with someone else's mess, and for the first time, he wondered if he had made a mistake in teaching them that love always shows up with gloves on. Maybe he had made them too good, so good that he had used their goodness up. He rolled up his sleeves anyway. The rubber gloves snapped faintly in the quiet house. The cleaning. Chemicals burned his nose. He scooped, scrubbed, bleached, flushed what little would go down. His back ached, not the quick ache of a long day, but the deep, hot soreness that stays between the shoulder blades and reminds a man he is not 30 anymore. When he was done, the bathroom didn't smell good, but it smelled possible. And sometimes that was all you could ask for. On the drive home, the sunset was a flat red band across the horizon, and the light made the cracked windshield glow. His hands on the steering wheel trembled, not with fear but with simple fatigue. The heater blew lukewarm air that smelled faintly of dust. He thought about calling David this time, the son who had always said yes, even if it meant driving across town at midnight. But he pictured the look in his son's eyes the last time he'd called. Love, yes, but behind it a quiet pleading.
Dad, please let us live our lives too.
So he didn't call. Days blurred. The tremor grew. Sometimes, when he pressed a screw into drywall, the bit slipped and scored the paint. Once, carrying a gallon of white semi-gloss, the shaking made his wrist jerk and paint splashed onto the floor in a fat, accusing star. He cursed then, softly, and then immediately felt ashamed. He wasn't angry at the paint. He was angry at his own body for failing the way old houses failed, slowly, inconveniently, in places that had once been strong. He began to listen to audiobooks more. At first it was because his eyes got tired. Then it was because he found comfort in the slow cadence of another man's voice. He chose the ones that took their time, long stories about families, about fathers who didn't say the right things until too late. The narrator spoke about the way light hit a kitchen table, about the smell of bread, about the creak of an old chair. He recognized his own life in their details. He would sit very still, hands folded to lessen the shaking, and let the words wash over him like warm water. But even in that quiet, the money did not fix itself. Another letter, another warning, a phone call from an office with a polite voice that was clearly reading from a screen.
Mr. Varela, we've noticed a pattern.
They always said pattern, as if they had been watching his whole life. He would say, "I'm working on it." And he believed he was. He always believed he was one hustle away from making it right, one good tenant away from being caught up. It was Daniel who finally said something hard. He came over on a Sunday with the smell of cold air still on his coat. He stood in the small kitchen looking at the papers fanned out like fallen leaves on the table. Arturo watched him, already defensive.
You're behind, Dad.
Daniel said quietly. "I know. I'll make it up."
No, Dad.
Daniel pulled out a chair and sat, elbows on knees, looking his father in the eyes the way he used to when he was 10 and wanted to be taken seriously.
You can't work your way out of it like before. You're tired. The houses are tired. You have to let us help. Really help. Not come patch, not give you money. Help make decisions.
The word decision sat heavy between them. Arturo bristled. The room suddenly smelled too strong of bleach and reheated beans. "I've been doing this longer than—"
Then I've been alive. I know, Dad,
Daniel finished, but not mockingly.
but you're not the only one alive anymore.
Silence. The fridge hummed. Somewhere outside, a car stereo thumped a slow bass line. Arturo looked at his hands. The tremor was visible now, a small wave traveling from wrist to knuckles. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to hand it all over, the ledgers, the keys, the stress. But inside him was a boy who had grown up with nothing, a boy who had taught himself to patch walls, to fix plumbing, to make houses stand again. That boy didn't know how to stop. "I don't want to be a burden," he said instead, eyes on the table. Daniel exhaled, a sound halfway between a sigh and a laugh of disbelief.
Dad, you've been carrying us our whole lives. Let somebody carry you for once.
It should have been the moment everything changed, but change for proud men comes slowly, like winter thawing from the edges. He let Daniel look at a few bills. He let Samuel call about one property. He let David check on a tenant, but he never fully opened his hands, not yet. And because he couldn't open them, things slipped through. One house went into such disrepair waiting for him to get to it that the only option was to sell it at a loss. Another had to be let go to cover a tax bill. Each loss was like losing a year of his life because every house carried memories of boys scraping, painting, laughing, complaining. The air in his chest felt cold and empty after each sale, like a room after furniture has been moved out, the outline of what once was still visible in the dust. The sons felt the loss too, but from a different angle. They weren't grieving the houses, they were grieving the version of their father who had seemed unbreakable, the man who could walk into a filthy unit and see it already restored, the man who could make 4 boys believe that skipping Christmas to paint was noble. To see him falter, to see his hands betray him, it did something to them. It made them softer, but It also made them pull back a little, the way people do when a long demanding job finally ends and they realize how tired they are. Calls went unanswered a little longer. Visits were a little shorter. They still loved him, but they had learned to set small fences around their time. He noticed. Of course he noticed. The apartment felt bigger on weekends now. The sunlight that poured in smelled like dust and orange peels from the bowl on the table. He would put on another audiobook, one with a slow narrator talking about forgiveness. And he would listen, while the radiator ticked and his hands shook in his lap. Inside him, something old and hard began to crack. Not his bones, but his certainty. He thought of the boys as little ones again, standing in the doorway of some wrecked rental, eyes wide at the mess adults had left. He heard his own voice telling them, "Family cleans up its own mess." And suddenly, for the first time in his life, he wondered if maybe he was the mess now, if maybe he was the one who needed to be cleaned up, fixed, carried. Outside, the late afternoon light went gold, then amber, then the blue of early evening. The apartment filled with that quiet, cool smell of night, concrete, distant cooking, somebody's laundry soap. Arturo sat a long time listening to the slow, even voice coming from the speaker. The story was about an old man who finally told his sons he was wrong. He closed his eyes and let the words sit on him like a blanket. He wasn't ready yet to say it out loud, but he was closer. The next weeks slid into spring. The city smelled of rain and diesel, of wet sidewalks and orange blossoms trying to bloom through exhaust. Arturo moved slower now. Every movement carried a small echo of effort. Every morning started with the same careful negotiation between stiffness and stubbornness. He sold another house, and the silence that followed the sale felt larger than the money it brought. The echo of footsteps in an empty hallway stayed with him long after the buyer's car disappeared. He didn't tell anyone that he cried that night. The tears surprised even him, tasting of dust and rust and relief. It was as if each nail he had ever hammered loosened in his chest all at once. He tried to keep up appearances. The sons came by when they could. They brought food that filled the apartment with good smells, roasted chicken, tortillas still hot, the kind of warmth that makes a home feel lived in. They talked about small things, the weather, the kids. None of them mentioned the properties or the tremor or the bills. The silence between their words was heavier than the words themselves. When they left, he would walk them to the door, the floor creaking beneath his slippers. He would smell the faint trace of their cologne and sweat in the hallway and stand there for a long time, hand on the frame, remembering when their shoulders fit beneath his palm. He would whisper the same thing every time. "Thank you for coming." The words tasted like apology. He tried working one more job that summer, a small patch-up on a property he still owned out near the highway. The day was blistering, the kind of Texas heat that turns paint into syrup and air into weight. The street smelled of tar, sun-baked, tires, and the faint sweetness of decaying grass. He parked, rolled down the windows, and sat a moment, listening to the insects humming like power lines. Inside the house was worse than he remembered. The carpet was stiff with dust, and every step sent up a small ghost of it. The air tasted metallic like old pennies. In the kitchen, the sink was full of dishes crusted into fossils. He stood there, hand-gripping the counter, waiting for the dizziness to pass. The tremor in his hand made the light on the counter dance. He managed to replace a section of drywall before noon, stopping often to wipe sweat from his neck. The heat smelled like himself. Salt and fatigue. At one point, he sat down on an overturned bucket and watched sunlight cut through the dusty air. The beam shimmered like a rope of gold stretching across ruin. He thought of the boys again. He thought of the long summers when they were small and obedient, and the work felt eternal and right. He hadn't noticed Daniel pull up outside. The door creaked, and his eldest's voice came softly from the hallway.
"Dad? You didn't tell us you were coming out here."
Arturo tried to smile, but it trembled like his hands. "Just finishing a few things," he said. The words came out thin, weak. Daniel crouched beside him, eyes scanning the half-finished wall. The smell of sweat and gypsum hung between them.
You don't have to do this anymore,
he said quietly. Arturo looked around, eyes adjusting to the dim. The walls, the tools, the ghosts of all those years. I know, he whispered, but I don't know how to stop. Daniel didn't argue. He just sat there with him in the smell of plaster and old dreams until the shadows lengthened and the heat softened into evening. That night, back in the apartment, Arturo left the windows open. The air smelled of rain approaching. Somewhere outside, someone grilled meat. The smoke drifted in, mixed with the sound of laughter. He lay on his bed and listened, and the ache in his arms felt almost holy. A reminder of everything he had carried, everything he had failed to lay down. In the weeks that followed, he stopped pretending. He called the boys, not for labor, but for company. They came. They brought the grandkids. The apartment began to smell of crayons and spilled juice and soap instead of solvent and dust. He caught himself smiling more, a small, fragile thing at first. When the doctor told him to rest, truly rest, he laughed. Rest from what? The doctor, a young man who smelled faintly of aftershave and latex gloves, smiled back.
From everything,
he said. So, Arturo tried. He listened to more books. He sat on the balcony watching the light move across the parking lot. He learned the names of the birds that landed on the railing. He kept a small notebook where he wrote things he remembered about the boys as children. How Daniel always checked if the back door was locked twice, how Samuel hummed while sweeping, how David used to line up nails in perfect rows, how Elias fell asleep in the truck with paint on his hands. He started to see his life not as failure, but as a long, messy proof of love. The houses were gone. Yes, the money too. But the boys had turned out steady, kind, alive. They had roofs over their heads, families who laughed, children who did not dread weekends. Sometimes in the quiet just before sleep, he would smell a ghost of those old days, turpentine, sweat, sawdust. And for a second, it hurt. Then he would breathe in the present air, filled with faint detergent and evening rain, and let it go. He would whisper to no one, "It's good again!" And he would mean it. Autumn came, slow and amber, the kind of season that smelled of dry leaves and old wood. The air held a sweetness that felt like memory. Arturo began to wake without an alarm now. His body seemed to rise and fall with the light itself. He moved quietly through the apartment, making coffee that filled the rooms with warmth and the faint scent of roasted beans. The tremor in his hands meant he spilled a little sometimes, and the dark splashes on the counter dried into small reminders of humility. The boys called more often. Their voices came through the phone full of background noises, the laughter of children, a dog barking, and a television murmuring. He would close his eyes and listen to those sounds as much as to their words. It made him feel part of something again. He didn't always answer right away. Sometimes he let the phone ring a few times just to feel wanted. One Saturday, they all came together, the apartment filled with smells, tortillas warming, the tang of lime squeezed over grilled meat, a faint whiff of cologne and laundry detergent as they hugged one another. The room buzzed with small talk and laughter, the kind that wove itself through the years of silence as if those years had only been a long breath. They brought photos, too, of the grandchildren, of school plays and first days of work, of houses that were bright and new. Arturo held each picture delicately, tracing the edges with fingers that still trembled. "You've built good lives," he said quietly, his voice thick with pride and regret mingled. "Better than mine," Daniel shook his head.
because of yours, Dad.
Later, when the food was eaten and the children had gone to sleep on the couch, the sons lingered. The room smelled of candle wax and coffee. The light was soft and gold. Arturo cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said, the tremor in his hand making the coffee in his cup ripple. "All those years, I made you work too hard. I made you miss things you shouldn't have missed." He looked at each of them, eyes wet but steady. "I thought I was building something that would keep us close." "I didn't see how it pushed you away." Samuel leaned forward, elbows on knees.
You gave us strength, Dad. You just forgot to rest with us.
Arturo smiled faintly, a crooked line that trembled into something tender. "I didn't know how," he said. No one spoke for a moment. The only sound was the refrigerator humming and the soft tap of rain beginning against the window. Then David stood, went to the kitchen, and began washing the dishes without being asked. The sound of running water filled the silence like a hymn. Elias helped him dry, his movements slow and careful, mirroring the rhythm their father had once taught them. The small apartment seemed to breathe again. When the evening ended, Arturo stood at the door watching his sons leave. The hallway light buzzed faintly, and the air smelled of rain and cologne and something else: peace. He lifted his hand in a small wave that shook but held steady long enough to be seen. Days later he sat by the window again, notebook open on his lap. The sun pooled across the pages, warm and pale. He wrote in slow, uneven letters. "Legacy isn't what you build with your hands. It's what your children choose to remember." The pen wobbled, leaving small splatters of ink that looked almost like tears. He didn't bother wiping them away. The audiobooks still played in the evenings. The narrator's voice had become a companion, calm, patient, describing simple things: the sound of wind through trees, the way bread smells when it's baking, the feeling of being forgiven. Arturo would close his eyes and let those words settle into the room. He would think about the 4 boys, men now, and the way their laughter had once filled the cab of the truck on long drives to houses that needed saving. He would think about his wife's quiet faith, about the smell of lemon cleaner and fresh paint, about how life had always been both beautiful and exhausting at once. Sometimes when the light was right, he imagined one of those old houses still standing somewhere. Maybe one he had forgotten, maybe one the new owners had cared for. He pictured the windows clean, the porch light glowing, a family inside laughing. He liked to think the walls still held the faint smell of paint and sweat from all those years ago, a trace of the Varela's work. It made him smile. Evenings grew earlier. The air cooled and carried the scent of wet pavement and the promise of another cold front. Arturo pulled a blanket over his knees and sat listening to the steady rhythm of his own breath. The tremor was still there, but softer now, as if even it had grown tired of struggle. He took a sip of coffee gone lukewarm and whispered, "It's good again." Outside, the streetlights flickered on, and for the first time in a long time, he felt no urge to fix a thing.